LinkedIn Live. So pleased and honored to have Kinga with us again. Kinga is just an outstanding individual, great LinkedIn connection, and a wonderful author that really works with her whole heart. And with that said, chat's open. The word of the day is process. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Kinga. She can share her first views on what process means, and always hoping the audience can bring their definition to it. Renadeb is the first one to share his insight. Great to have you. So Kinga, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. So happy to be here. I am back in Austin today, and this word is pretty meaningful to me. I shared last week that in my former life, I was a VP of program management. And so people immediately assume that they think process when they hear that. And so, when we're thinking of a larger system, like an organization, we're thinking about people and processes, right? We just kind of throw that word in there. And what does that really mean? Oftentimes it starts to turn into workflows and things like that. So I'd love to hit on that topic at some point today. Also, when we think about our own thought processes, that's something that we go through. And so there's so many different ways to interpret this word. And right before the show, Donald and I, as we were catching up, we were talking about my writing journey and how I am kind of going through a process of learning a lot about myself and changing my mind. And that's a process in itself. So excited about this word. It's an interesting one.
Oh, for sure. And, I believe it's a word that everybody utilizes every day,
Yeah.
right? There's a process with driving your car, there's a process with cooking your lunch, there's a process with about everything. The question is, how well does the process serve you, and how much do you serve the process? So is it working for you, or are you always working for it to make it work for you? And I think it's really about the dynamic nature of the world today of communication,
Mm-hmm.
that if you're not adjusting your process, it really has a lot to do with more than you. Sometimes it gets adjusted for you. When your internet goes down, what happens to your process then?
Yeah.
So many interesting perspectives and insights. Ashif's here, and when Ashif's here, we know great comments are following. What a great individual, supports so many people. I love to have him on the show. Have an invitation out there anytime he's wanting to. Be happy and proud to bring him on. So getting back to process, Kinga. It seems like it could be more than an afterthought, that most people could start to invest in that. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, there's it's an interesting thing because it's something that oftentimes people want a process up front because I think that it gives them a sense of security. And what they might be asking for is, hey, at least for me, in my former life as a VP of program management, right? People would say, "What's the process for this?" And they thought that it would give them a clearly defined set of rules and systems to work within, and that felt like it was giving them some security and clarity around what was expected. And when I was trying to get people into an agile mindset and for that flexibility that you're talking about, I was trying to actually ban the word process for a while and use the word framework, because I thought, well, we have guiding principles. We have things that we want to always keep in the back of our mind. What makes sense should always trump what we are doing. Always let logic and conversations and then communication around it, be the ruling factor. over just following these defined steps, so that we are not bound by these defined steps unless they have to be there for compliance reasons. Maybe there are certain situations where we have to follow a process. And so I felt like it was very limiting sometimes when we wanted to be so clearly defined on a process, and that it didn't allow us this freedom, this empowerment to think beyond what we thought these certain steps were. And so I wanted to stay away from these clearly defined steps and outlines, because it was just something we had to maintain. And so as an afterthought, it just became a heavy documentation for everybody rather than a good understanding of how we operate. And so I think that it's good when you reflect on your past to say, okay, what are the ways that we now understand how we work together, or what's the best way for me to work for myself, and to figure that out and to talk about it and iterate on it. And so that becomes my process.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it looks like you put quite a bit of thought into it. And I think that's important, because confidence in a process makes everything go a lot smoother than if you're tentative or new to something. You're kind of curious, will it work, versus something that always seems to work all the time and you take for granted. But even simple things aren't always easy when they go awry.
Right.
And the key is how resourceful, how responsive, how reactive can you be when the process isn't working.
Right.
Let's say you have a credit manager, and all of a sudden they're setting wrong credit limits to wrong people. What happens when that process isn't followed? So, what it also lends itself to is lending itself to other areas. So your process, if malfunctioning, will start impacting someone else's process, because everything somehow feeds together at the end of the month.
Mm-hmm.
Right? All the pluses, all the minus, and then the financial people add it all up and share the results with everyone. So if you want better results, improve processes, especially the ones with bottlenecks, the ones that, don't have to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
And usually those processes that go awry are processes that are people dependent, not system dependent. Right? So if you're system dependent, it doesn't matter who's working that day. Doesn't matter their personality. What's your thoughts, Kinga? Looks like you've got a wealth of experience.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you brought it back to the information, like kind of the impact that somebody might have, and the awareness around the data point. I think the transparency. So the way that I viewed this was, within an organization, let's say we have several people working towards a common goal. If we all understand what that common goal is, and we all understand what our part is towards that common goal, and we all understand where we stand against it and how we're monitoring it and how our pieces fit into that bigger picture, then and we truly take the time to talk about it, and our meetings are used in an effective way where that's what the discussion is around, the risks to that, then we have a good understanding. We should be able to quickly adjust any kind of communication style. We don't need this over engineering of dictating, you talk to this, has to follow this, because naturally people will do what makes sense to support those common goals. And I found in my past that when I tried to be the one that said, no, you follow this, and then this person has to hand off to this person, and we do all these approvals, that if there was a misstep, then they look to the person that wrote the process to say, oh, well, I just followed the process. And so they start taking ownership. And so to me, there was this falling of ownership. And really what it comes down to is we want to understand the impact that we have towards our common goal. We want to understand the impact that we have on others. And so it's this real feeling of ownership of that common goal. And then we don't need as much process when we start to truly focus on that common goal.
Well, that sounds so very organized, and valid. And I think, that's really the key, is understanding there's more to it than meets the eye, especially when you're involving people into the situation, where you can't just draw straight lines all the time, or barriers, because there's always going to be a little overlap, a little of culture, a little of whatever it is that supports that company and the people in it. But I think the key words is responsibility and accountability,
Yeah.
right? Because who's in charge of something or responsible, but more importantly, who takes responsibility? Is the person in charge always pointing the finger at somebody else or something else? Or are they just accepting things as they're given?
Mhm.
And I think that's something that's most important about the process,
Mhm.
is learning to have integrity with the process.
Yeah.
Because, especially in sales, there's so many ways to, hey, I'll save the business till the first quarter when I can start fresh, or I'll never make my numbers. Why would I put them in now?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, there's a conflict between a personal or professional goal and
Mhm.
the corporate or the company reason for being. And that's not even to talk about politics or bureaucracy. So,
Mhm.
you really have to build a very strong house of brick,
Mhm.
and then take responsibility. Because if people don't appreciate people taking responsibility, they're definitely not going to be rewarding people who are irresponsible.
Right.
So, what's your thoughts on all that, Kinga?
Yeah, there's always kind of, we called it like gamification, right? And so we're focused on the wrong thing when we're trying to gamify the numbers. And in a healthy environment, we wouldn't be focused on that. And so we'd be having the right conversations around what are we trying to actually achieve. It's not this arbitrary number. It would be around what is most impactful for everybody. And so I think that we are starting to have to look at business different, and the way that business models are different. There's a book that I came across last night. It's called Humanocracy, and it's by Greg Hamill. And he's presenting this idea of change that needs to happen really quickly in corporate. And it's kind of breaking down this old way of thought. And it's something that I've always believed in and written in part of my transformation plans for a company. And it's around, we really need to be, he's calling it mobilize. And to me, that's the agility model. And it's around, really not saying this is the way we've always done things. It's saying, hey, we might have to just break down the systems and kind of rebuild it around what's important. And there's just some really great concepts here, but it's around also for me thinking that we use words like empowerment, but that comes with such a huge sense of responsibility too. It sounds like a great buzzword and something that people rally around and get excited. Yes, I want to be empowered. And hopefully they understand that with empowerment comes responsibility. And so, we're not just free to run around and, just have a party. So, which would be great. But with that comes responsibility and accountability. And so having this common goal and having those conversations around that common goal and understanding your impact with everybody and us holding each other mutually accountable for that is that accountability piece and that responsibility.
Yeah, and I think, it fits hand in glove with, being able to be a more integrated, collaborative, flexible organization if your processes continue to adjust to the situation at hand, to future demand and expectation. So it's really the person, in a sense, who sets the course.
Mhm.
by integrating processes. And I think the big question that always comes in is why? Why do we need another process? I mean, and that's the thing. I remember having all these retail stores, and the hardest thing was when I got my second store because I couldn't be at the other one all the time. I had to give it up for someone to look after it or open and close it for me. And it's the same thing with when you have a manual, right? Here's an operating manual for the store. Well, it's funny how more policies get added, but none get deleted, right? And you got a policy from 20 years ago about gift certificates that we don't even take anymore. But it's like, well, it's a policy. People look at it like it's a law or a rule or something sacred, versus it's just like a little bit of a code to how do you do something when a customer is irate? How do you close the store? Whatever the case. But before we get too far, Renadep's here. So great to see you. Good morning. Ashif, we talked about, is here. So great to see you. We have Omar, who's a big proponent of Zoom Party. Really interesting concept that he does. And just a great guy if you get a chance to meet him. Ashif says, trust the timing of your life. Process is closely related to patience. So true. Ashif says, measure it as you move. So true. You can't manage what you can't measure. And everything at a certain point needs to be tracked, right? If you decide, hey, we're going to get a new customer complaint policy, and then after a month, we're going to see what difference did it make. Did we save time? Did we satisfy more people? And that's where processes start to adjust, because you start out with, here's our intention or our goal. Here's our process to get there. Let's look at how it measured up. And then we can change the process. But also, I think that's so important, is the ownership of the process really begins and ends with the people who are going to initiate it or manage it, right? So if you don't allow them to have a voice, an understanding, an ability to ask a lot of questions prior to implementing it, then you're going to be a double whammy in a sense, because you're going to deal with the issue, and then you're going to deal with a bunch of people who don't feel invested. Like no one cared enough about them, and now they have to care more about a customer. So everything has to roll downhill in equal fashion. Natalie's here. So great to see you, Natalie. Good morning. We're talking about process, and hopefully everybody, and that's the call out now, is what's your thoughts on process? What's your experience with process? Most people, I think, when they hear process, feel paperwork, red tape. I got to go through the process. They won't just give it to me. I got to take the test. I got to talk to someone. I got to pay my fee. That's the process, right? Just like getting a driver's license or you name it, you go through the process. And most processes, if you want to visualize, is a long row of administrative people taking numbers. Waiting in line is usually part of the process, even if you're in a company, because who gets the news first, who gets to implement it, who gets the credit for it. It gets, that's why solopreneurs, entrepreneurs have such an advantage over top-heavy, sloppy, bureaucratic organizations. Because most of those processes, in a lot of cases, are to support those people more than the people who they're supposed to be supporting or responsible for. So, honesty, integrity go a long way. Kinga, a lot of coverage.
Yeah, you brought up so many good points. I should have been jotting notes. But I think about, back to your point on the manual, right? And why do we hold on to these legacies? It's almost like it becomes this archive of all the what ifs that ever came up, because for some reason, sometimes people go, they poke holes in it, and then they want to be so prepared. And so as a leader, you might feel like, okay, like I'll arm you with every what if so you feel safeguarded. But then are we really empowering people? Because we're kind of just saying, I'll be your safety net, rather than I trust you, you can figure it out, it'll be fine. Right. And so it is. And I think that is a shift, as you're recognizing that we are moving towards so many solopreneurs and entrepreneurs, but also just a shift in time that we have been historically in this very hierarchical society where we did need to ask permission. And so that's kind of how our brains, or at least mine, was trained. I had to ask permission before I could make a move. And so I love that this newer generation of thinking is, we don't have to ask for permission for everything. People are almost at this decision fatigue. I know I am. Sometimes people say, what do you want for dinner? And I am so relieved if somebody just says, hey, this is what we're having for dinner. And I'm like, right on. Like, I don't want to make the decision, right? Because I really genuinely don't care. Where, when we weren't at such a decision fatigue place in our lives, maybe we wanted more control, or somehow that control meant something to us. And I think now we're all, a little bit more understanding of, I can only handle so much. I only want so many decisions. I'm ready to let go, or I have to let go, or, we're recognizing that people have to let go of this power because the trust within organizations is breaking down so much if we don't let go. And so it's just part of that, that really we don't need to ask for so much permission that we're used to doing. And so we say, yeah, let's just kind of scrap that. That's old. And now if it comes up, either deal with it or give me a call, and it's no big deal. But having this massive book, how are you going to do when there is a crisis, really? And that reminds me of that book, Checklist Manifesto. And I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but it's, what do you do in a crisis? That's what we really need to know for the most part is, and I think the opening story with that book is, a plane is going down. Do you want to bust out your manual and start reading about how to fly a plane? Right? No, you need to know, what do I need to do in this moment, right? That's when you need to process. Check this, check this, check this, right? And so that's where I would try to keep it, so that it in a moment. And so I think crisis management is absolutely an appropriate place to have a documented process or something, right? So when people go, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do, we give them those tools so that they do feel safe. But otherwise, yeah, keep it about the trust.
Well, I think that articulates it so well, because too many people over process something.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I say processed foods aren't very good for you, because they've been run through so many times that by the time they get to you, most of the nutrients are gone.
Yeah.
If a process has been run through the mill too many times, pretty soon it's like vanilla. There's nothing really here, nothing against vanilla people,
Yeah.
But it's like, why not just be able to be responsive and use the process as a guide, not totally as an absolute.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if something different happens, maybe the process doesn't allow for that, mm-hmm. or reward that. Right. And then that really comes down to how much autonomy and authority you have in making decisions on your feet. Right? Where you would be rewarded to say, you're lucky you didn't follow the manual, because that would have cost more, taken more, done something more than we didn't want. Mm-hmm. And that's really a cultural and environmental issue too. It's like, you always hear those stories of some customer that was needy, and the person behind the counter bought them a hamburger or gave them something, and it was really against maybe corporate rules. But after corporate saw it and went social media, they reward the person, right, for knowing enough in the situation
Right.
to make their own decisions. And I think that's important. If you can't work with or for people who reward your intelligence, your judgment, your integrity,
Right.
you're not a good fit,
Right.
right? And every process will be an accommodation, right? Versus, hey, I love coming to work here because they make it easy for me to make everybody happy. They make it easy for me, because they take an interest in my life and give me these extra benefits, versus what can everybody get away with.
Right.
And that's usually the process is like, try to get two for the price of one. Like make sure they're happy, but don't make sure it costs us too much, or don't make sure it doesn't take us too much time. And it's kind of like the us is always in front of what you're doing,
right,
and what they're sharing and telling you to do. So, communication, I think, is vital. Natalie comes back with a great comment. My thoughts go towards the process of integration, whether integrating into a new community, a new company, or a new role. I agree that patience is key, and also understanding thoroughly what is expected. And that's part of the packaging and presentation of the process, right? When you introduce it, where do you introduce it? How do you introduce it? Who's introducing it? Is the CEO or just the store manager who created something for his staff? And I think if you want, there's a saying, people respect what they expect you to inspect, right? And if you put something out and you say you're going to follow up and you don't, then you might as well not put anything out, because you've already lost the integrity of the presentation and communication. And everybody listens and everybody hears. Not everybody does everything, but it does work its way up to eventually get an impression of, oh, here's where I'm working at. Here's who I'm working for, and that good or bad. And that defines your kind of how you get up in the morning and go to work. What's your thoughts, Kinga?
Yeah, I can't help but relate it back to my former days, and I think about where we started this conversation, and I said I wanted to ban the word process, and I was hired to roll out an agile process, and I said I'm calling it the agile framework, right? And I wanted to introduce people to a framework. And I wanted them to understand that that's how I saw it, because I could coach them through the principles. I could coach them through what we were trying to accomplish. I could coach them through what I saw working well, what I didn't see working well. And then I showed up, right? I showed up to meetings, and then I coached them through how to feel empowered by not making decisions for them, by encouraging them to fail, by encouraging them to experiment and try different things, by encouraging them to own their decisions, right? And to own their commitments, and really to encourage them to be their own team. Because I said, one day I'm going to walk away and join another team and help them, because we have a lot of teams here. I was scaling. And so I really needed everybody to understand this is to make you kind of the self-sufficient entity. And we can't do that if you're expecting me to sit here and document and help you and to make sure that everybody, no, you talk to you and you do this. And, the whole point was for them to be so empowered that they knew how to work with one another, and that they would adjust accordingly to accomplish their goals. Right. And so, that's kind of where I took that. Every team had their own. They had their own set of rules. They had, and then there was there's this basic thing. We had to meet some high level goals that were common across the organization, or maybe the department, or that are required. But at a certain point, how they achieve that was up to them, and that was okay. And I'm talking about within a software company, which is a little bit different than a retail store. But there, you understand where there's flexibility and where there's not. And we talked about that openly. And that was a very important conversation for me to have with the leadership team, is to say, I need a good alignment discussion with the leadership team around where you're going to support me in where you are going to back me up, that we will be letting go of control, and where we won't be. What are the negotiables and not? Because the worst thing that can happen is I say, yes, you have the freedom to make these decisions. And I say that to a team that they have this, flexibility, and then their manager comes in and says something different, right? And so I really needed that leadership buy-in first, and say, hey, as the people that are actually setting the vision of the company, the people that ultimately do pay the check, are handing out the checks, that they are bought in and agree that we've hired smart people, we are entrusting them, and that they'll know best what to do.
Yeah, I think that's so valid, and when I think of process, and when I was listening to what you were saying, a lot of it has to do with industry too. Some are regulated industry, so some processes are required, right? So a return policy in a retail store is not as significant as if you're doing legal documents or financial documents or engineering documents, where there's codes, there's rules, there's regulations. So it's not even a free choice. But again, it's just as important that people understand what the process is. That's why there's so much training that takes place in companies and from outside of companies to make sure everybody's compliant, everybody can sign off on everything they just learned. And again, a lot of it is for justification, for liability issues, right? Because people want to know, well, let's see your book, right? Let's see your processes. If there's a weather event or whatever, how were you prepared? So, I think that makes it even more important in this litigious society of ours, and the inability for people to take full responsibility at times. And that's a consideration. So a word by itself seems process very easy, but when you start really layering it on to so many other elements, industry situations, you can see how really important it is. Schiff says, make it simple but significant. I think that's the best approach with any process. Less is more, right? I mean, keep it simple, make it easy for everybody, and make it fun if you can. A process doesn't have to be like some millstone that people carry around. It can be something as, hey, they're allowing me to take care of this today, right? Whatever that process is. I'm going to the ballpark and passing a check along to some charity. Whatever it is, that's my process, and my meaning for today is to serve the process. And I think when you can get aligned with the processes, and hopefully if you had something to do with engineering, then you even have more ownership in the success of them, because everybody will remember who came to us with this idea and then who made it happen. And the big question is, what happened? And I think that's where you can write your own ticket, is create an opportunity, perform it if possible, and get benefit, and actually get up front some sort of insight as to, why am I even doing this? And if it does work really well, how do I participate? someone would say, well, that's an extra reward, but if there's an extra reward, maybe there's an extra effort to make sure it gets done.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I think process has to be based on equality, fairness, right? Because once someone starts getting away with something, that sets the new bar or the new tolerance for everybody to do it. So, anyways, there's so much that can be rippled from process to so many
Mm-hmm.
people involved. I mean, it's a lot of fun when it works and it works well. When people say, now I've gained clarity, I got a much better understanding of what my job is here, what my position is, because it's all defined for me now. And there's maybe an ongoing, continuous discussion that takes place.
Mm-hmm.
That every week or two, or more importantly, the supervisor should be the one visiting the people, should be going up on a regular basis and say, hey, remember we talked about that? You had a little bit of an issue. Is there an issue still? Or is there something I can add to it? Or more importantly, we're very concerned and interested in your opinion of how it's going and what could we do to make it better, right? So it's not like, go get them, Tiger, here's the stuff. But we really do care about what's going on the ground level where you're at and what feedback can you bring. Because the more you value people in so many different ways, the more they'll feel valued.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's consistent and sincere, then they're going to be more interested. They're going to listen a little harder. And especially if they have a voice, and their voice gets heard properly to the people who need to hear their voice, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think that makes it so valuable. So, it looks like based on your experience building teams, helping with process, it's an art in itself, wouldn't you say, Kinga?
I would. And I think that you were an agile coach in your former life too. That's what I'm thinking. Because it is so much about this reflection. We would call it this retrospective is built into our cadence and our rhythm of business. And so we would genuinely do it as a forcing function that we would stop and pause and say, let's examine and say what was working well for us, and where were we frustrated, where were things kind of breaking down, is there anything that we need to adjust? And so it's a very conscious thing that we would do, and that's how we would improve. And it wasn't so overwhelming to do it at this once a year event, and then we go, oh gosh, I don't really remember what happened throughout the year, right? If you're doing it incrementally and you're just kind of keeping up with it, it's relevant, it's fresh, and everyone feels a part of it. And so it goes back to how right before the show started and you and I were catching up about, I'm writing my book, and you have these moments of revelation where oh gosh, my light bulb moment, and you have this thought, the clarity in something, and you go, oh, my approach, if I had this clarity moment, I would have approached things totally different. And then I just want to redo everything because I get so excited about my clarity. And I think that's one of the things that one of the skills that I have, and something that I like offering people, is to say, in hindsight, I really enjoy reflecting on processes or things or journeys that I've been through, and how can I make it simple? How can I give somebody the fastest route to success based off of my experience, right? And then learn from them going through it so that we can continue to make things easier. And that's a process in itself, is that learning process, and our own thought process of how do we reflect, and do we take the time to stop and reflect and to iterate on how we do things, and why we do the things that we do. So reflection is a huge part of my process, my personal growth process. And I think that is a really key part of life experience, is to to think about process, not just in this team setting, but within ourselves. And to say, do I have a process for growth? Do I have a process that I am applying to myself? And so that for me is really important, is that I stop every week or so, and whether it's a journaling, or I take all my notes and I consolidate them, because I collect so much information that if I looked back on it a month or two later, I go, oh, I don't even remember why I collected this, or what meaning did it have. But if I create a good system of organization for me, then I go, oh, okay, it fits into this framework, and I just keep updating my framework. So how you manage yourself is a process.
Oh, absolutely. And I think along with that, when I'm thinking about process, sometimes you have to have a process to create the better process.
Mhm.
Because if you look at models, it's like, here's the 1.0 version, here's the 2.0 newly updated version. I mean, if you look at software, what version are you up to? What do you need to download? So it's continual, as if, or put it this way, if you don't, you find out a lot of what you use doesn't work anymore, right?
Mhm.
Because not everything's supported forever.
Yeah.
So if you say, hey, I don't need to upgrade it, I don't need to purchase it, well, eventually you'll have to do something. And in the meantime, everything runs a little bit worse because of not being in sync.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have no control over whether you participate. It's just, are you proactive or reactive, or just realistically active? And again, it depends on what your time frame in your confidence in your ability and time to change,
Mhm.
right? If I know a storm's coming within a day, I'll make sure I get my umbrella,
Yeah.
versus, not having an umbrella, which is a whole different story. So I think you got to trust yourself to allow what you believe to at least be somewhat seen. And sometimes a toe in the water is enough to feel how the temperature is. You don't need to dive in initially. That whole saying of measure twice and cut once.
Mhm.
It's easier to get aggressive after you've gone past the caution stage,
Mhm.
because now you feel you're safe enough to open things up. And the other thing is again, does it improve things, or does it just protect things?
Yeah.
So is the process there because of a redundancy or a need for over explanation or emphasis? And it's funny how people repeat it, thinking the more they repeat it, the more it's going to be interpreted or retained. And I think in a lot of cases, which is a good example, is seeing what it looks like in practice,
Yeah.
right? Have some role playing. Customer comes in the store, asks for this, you say this, they say this. This is where the policy starts to fall into play,
Mhm.
And then whose interest is this, right? Is this the person in the store, the customer, the company, or all three?
Mhm.
Being able to identify that is important.
Mhm.
So I think it's something that people take for granted. People say, where's the policy book? And they never open it.
Yeah.
How many times you get a 20-page contract with fine print? All you do is sign it at the end, because there's no way you're going to spend 20 pages looking at fine print, and you're not going to spend that extra money
Or understand it.
or spend the money on an attorney. Uh, and most of that stuff never comes up. But the thing is again, it's time versus reward.
Mhm.
And how many times can you look at process? And then how many times do you even care?
Yeah.
Or does in other words, some companies and let's say CEOs are real proud of their policies and their procedures. But how does the customer think?
Right.
Tell a customer something, says, forget that. I'm not going to do that. What do you
Mhm.
do next?
Yeah.
And I think that's really the key. And in my businesses, it was always, if you're going to do something, do it fast and do it with a smile.
Mm-hmm.
Because if that's the way it's going to go, faster, happier, over,
Yep.
you know. And I think that saves everybody the inconvenience of being in the middle,
Yep.
representing something they never really had anything to do with. Because if you really look at customer service, they're the ones who have to adhere to most of the biggest policies because they're returning things, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
making commitments to people. But what they do say is customer service is your number one sales opportunity.
Yeah.
Right? To make an unhappy person happy, to reassure a person that might have been a little bit wobbly on what the policy was. And I know everybody has a hard time sometimes going in and returning something because in their own way, they know there's some responsibility to it. How much of the ice cream do you eat before you take it back? I mean, I don't know that answer. Natalie says, have to run. Great talk. Plenty of insights. Thank you, King and Now. Thank you, Natalie. Fine lady. Connect with Natalie. You won't be sorry. Ashif says, change the process, never the goal. You know, sometimes the process is the goal, and sometimes the goal is the process. Depends on how interchangeable you want to make these words.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an attitude more than anything else. You know,
Mm-hmm.
process should create more positive attitudes all around. Kinga, covering a lot of ground today fast.
We are. And I'm thinking about relating to your customer service example. And I think about my days when I was waiting tables, which I did a lot through college. And there was something that stood out to me. And I averaged, not to brag, but I averaged about 25% tips in my tips. And the thing that really, like, my guiding principle that I held true to was always make eye contact and scan the room. Always be available, and so that if somebody needs to flag me down, I'm available to them. And that way they know that here I am, and that be sincere and kind, right? And that's what people want. So they're forgiving of mistakes. And yes, the goal is to get them their food as quickly as possible, but I can't control necessarily if the cook screws up their food or something happens. I realized that there were things that were beyond my control, or sometimes physically I could not keep up, right? So people are a lot more forgiving, though, for me, when I held true to my guiding principle of just paying attention and realizing that that's what the customers really wanted. Although they wanted their food, from me personally, they understood what my limitations were, and that's what they wanted from me. And so it was my availability and my kindness and paying attention. And by giving them eye contact and always being available and noticing that I'm working as hard as I can, right? And so that was really important to me, and I got good tips. And now that I kind of have been paying attention throughout my life, nothing frustrates me more when I'm like, I think I went out to dinner with my mom while I was in South Carolina, and we got through our appetizer, and about halfway through our dinner before we could flag down our waitress to get a refill on our drink. And I was like, this took a really long time. Like, somebody dropped off our food, but then they were just dropping it off and not interested in taking our drink order. And so it was really interesting to me that she walked by and we were waving and she's looking down, right? And so what matters to you and how you see yourself in your role, and how you your own kind of process of how you're viewing yourself and your role in your interaction, and again back to your impact and the impact that you want to make is just really important.
Yeah, I think you cover so many wonderful areas and important viewpoints, because I'm in agreement. I think awareness is so vital to everything, because I know when I was working in a grocery store and making tips, I knew attention and attentiveness was everything, right? And when I'm going out to dinner too, I want someone there before I need them, right? So in other words, but you need to be proactive and say, hey, I'm really big on water. Please make sure you keep this thing going here. Or we're not going to order for 30 minutes. We just want to be left alone. Or we're in a big hurry. We got to get in and out. And what you do is you start looking at the person when they leave your table. And if they go to the corner and start talking to their co-person and they're just hanging out, and meanwhile your food's sitting there waiting to get picked up and delivered, your water's not, and they're just hanging out. And that's what Jim Rohn once said, is if you really want to guarantee quality service, tip in advance. Say here's a really nice tip, but here's exactly how I need the evening to go, right? Whatever it is. And that way you're pretty much guaranteed, if you can be, to the service you wanted, versus, oh, I hope they're a good server today. I hope they understand what it is. They won't. And there's nothing wrong with telling that person, because then you get the conflict for the tip.
Yeah.
Someone says they never came here, never once talked to us, the food was cold, that we asked twice for rolls and they never showed up. But then the guilt is, well, how do you not leave a tip? Depends on how you feel and, everything else. But it puts you in an uncomfortable position in that you'd rather have a much nicer evening, make a nice bigger tip, because in most people, it's a job for them waiting on people. Some people could be the only night out they go that year. It could have been a special celebration, right? And all.
Yeah, I have a hard time with that one, because I guess from a server's perspective, I went in with the positive assumption that people would tip accordingly, and that I would get a good tip if I gave good service. And I think it might have made me feel a little bit like I'm being judged from the first minute, when I didn't want to feel so judged, because I just assumed that I was doing a good job, and I assumed that they thought I was doing a good job. So I don't know how I feel about that one, but I do think that I understand when you want to make expectations clear, and I think that's your point. Is I want to make expectations clear, and I think that there's nothing wrong with that. Of, hey, these are my preferences, and they're important to me, and I really need you to understand my preferences, and I need you to understand that I'll take care of you if you make my preferences a priority. I think that conversation is okay, right? And I think expressing that in a certain way is good and healthy, to say to people, hey, this is what I have going on. That to me is a kind of good heart to heart with somebody. This is, and I love that. Hey, I have 30 minutes. There's nothing more annoying than when you're in a deep conversation. It's very clear that you are in a deep conversation with somebody, and you get interrupted over something that you clearly don't need in the moment. Your glass is full of water and they offer you water, or something like that. And you're like, what? Like I'm crying and I'm having a moment with somebody. What? So yeah,
well, I think that's so relevant to the earlier discussion, is even if you're the CEO, making sure people know why you're doing it, right? What your intent is, what your hope is, and what they'll be able to appreciate because of you sharing more with them. Because some people just, here it is, go do it.
Yeah.
Right. And other people will actually sit down, hear what you have to say, answer your questions, because questions and answers are so important, because you can't anticipate everybody's question. Everybody's situation is somewhat different than everybody else. So unless they're heard and seen, it's a benefit to everybody. Say, well, I wasn't aware of that. Now that I know, we'll make an adjustment. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it saved us from pursuing something that wasn't, really tightened up before it left here. I think it's the congratulations, the recognition, and even to a hostess or host, It's
Hmm.
also giving a compliment beyond a tip,
Yeah.
right? Thank you so much. You were just great tonight and you made our evening special,
Yeah.
right? I mean, so,
Yeah.
and that's what someone said at a conference, and I took it to heart, is they always said if someone does something really nice for you, don't leave it at thank you.
Yeah.
Explain thank you for what.
Yeah.
That's all it took. Like when you leave an airplane, it's a nice, safe, comfortable flight. Thank you so much for providing such a wonderful, safe flight today. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
couple extra words, but to that person, they probably hear that once or twice, whenever. And also, if everybody around them, it's a staff, it's a team working together. So if the captain or co-pilot or whatever they call themselves gets a compliment, the whole ship gets a compliment for it. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden, you're spreading joy, which is a greater tip in some ways for some people than the financial aspect of it. So, I think, it's nice we come back full circle,
Hmm.
find satisfaction, find comfort, and maybe look at process as a very positive thing.
Hmm.
Again, it's how it's done. And another thing, who you're with.
Yeah.
So whatever team you're on makes everybody else either better or worse for being on the team together,
Yeah.
right? And that's all you can hope for, is a little bit better every day with a few more people. So
Yeah.
with that, Kinga, any final thoughts or words? It comes up on an hour really quick.
I know it just flies right by. While you're talking about people showing appreciation and how that's maybe part of your process, I was thinking, talking about this dinner with my mom. We were entering the restaurant, and there was a group of ladies that were leaving, and I held the door open, and they're filtering out, and the last woman looked at me, and she very purposefully looked me in the eye and said, "I appreciate you." And even just saying a full 3 words, but enunciating the 3 words and looking me in the eye and saying, "I appreciate you," made me feel seen. It wasn't a lot of people walked through and didn't say a word because, that was kind of the right, I guess, way that they leave first and I hold the door open. And a lot of people just said thanks, but for someone to stop and give me a look in the eye and say, "I appreciate you," made me feel seen in a different way. And so helping people feel seen in a different way is something that we can all do and give. It's free and it's beautiful. And I appreciate you, Donald, and all of our audience. So let that be part of our process today.
Well, that's just terrific because you were great today, as always. And, naturally, you're right in tune with the process and how it can impact so many people, and being from the service industry, both in hospitality as well as corporate and sales with process. It gives one so much more experience and background versus talking about some ethereal philosophy that kind of conjecture and hope and belief versus reality. And I think after one gains awareness and understanding, it's appreciation and how to take advantage of it. So that's part of mastery, is once you can get a feel for it, and then you can understand how you can impact it in a positive way, even if it's just delivery, even if it's just presentation, even if it's just being a strong team member and saying, "I'm going to go to extra mile for this cause or for this process because I believe in it." And it gives everybody that opportunity to show themselves and demonstrate their value. Sheaf says most people just want to be in the result and not in the process. Well, yeah, it's always better to be payday. Marissa says, "Good morning, a new individual. Haven't seen you. Thank you for coming." But with that said, we're at top of the hour. I want to thank everybody so much. Come back tomorrow. We're going to have Leslie Flowers and Catherine Chadwick with us. Should be a great show. And with that said, make your process work for you more and more every day.